So the ethics of the death cult are actually a fight between three ghosts of the Trinity. So there would be a logic, an ethic, and a pathos to each part of the Trinity that decides whether or not you're allowed into Greece. And Greece is the origin of whether or not Europe gets to survive in outer space. So a lot of the time in outer space, Europe is considered a origin state, which means it does not generate its own privacy. It generates agreements to destroy one another. And a lot of these states are warring faction periods between whether or not they get to destroy the central core of their society and accepting them back into the pillar of love, which is to be a God believer. So, since being a God believer is a central point of accepting the belief of utility, utility is no longer part of the actualization process of capital. And capital is seized and dismissed for the idealizations of witnessing the Pope. So, if a Pope is to create a organized religion falls apart and then it's replaced by a democracy. So democracy forms once organized religion no longer appears to have a god in it. And God would be the central point of whether or not your democracy is at war. Because God used to be a peaceful subject, it no longer allowed itself to survive. It used to be passive, not only peaceful. So if God is so passive that he dies, not only does war break out between other people, the meaning of death becomes part of the ingrained society, so that deterioration of your faculty begin to take witness on witnesses of higher God. So this is called a drug overdose of nepotism. And there are corruptions that originate whether or not what nepotism is actually part of whether or not you conceal your identity after the collapse of God. So God wouldn't be founded on whether or not you are a spiritual being actually. It would be founded on whether or not you are a material witness of a church. And churches are orders of operations greater than God Himself. Because God doesn't have a church, God would actually be part of a organized union with the state. And the state decides whether or not God survives. And that is his burial ceremony and whether or not he gets to be ingratiated to an afterlife. So the burial ceremony of God would be the witnessing of a dilemma. And there are four dilemmas called the high, the awakening, the reckoning, and the crisis. So these four dilemmas are generational conflicts that happen within society because they keep happening over and over again, witnessing the death of God. So if the death of God happens religiously, not only does the next generation pass over the sins happen at mass, which means the masses have to pray to make themselves feel normal again, which means they organize religion to funeral rites. And this is only to prevent war, not to prevent anything but. And this is how a society based on God would look. A society based on God would be a dilemma system that doesn't allow for preaching to occur. Because preaching would be massive, it would actually be part of the reckoning itself. So if this is a system of opening up doors, not only do these doors accept one another into leaving behind the society would have a god in itself called a machine. These machines would be whether or not you open up these valves for accepting in newcomers. And these newcomers are priests that do not open worship into a dilemma. They actually open worship into the church, which is the killer of God. So if God is the death of the church, not only does the idea that the Father has to return to deliver the archangels their meaning back into their lives, the meaning of God would be left over into the person named Jesus. And Jesus would be whether or not you get to be part of the church at all, which is a Taoist religion for pagans. Since the only way into the church is through a funeral rite, Hindus have accepted this religion as if it's meaningful, which means they do not doubt it. They accept it wholeheartedly, genetic faction wise, because the genetic factions would run into them because they still believe in the church. And these churches are how Europe formed into an outer space union by accepting that Wicca was not part of their religion, by accepting that Wicca was actually part of God's religion. So if Europe is free of God, then the death cult loses meaning, and the people themselves open up obituary for making salvation possible for anyone who wants to be part of God's union. And God's union would need to survive for Europe to become German. And Germany would be the system of whether or not you keep in contact with the church and organized religion so that all of society has an atmosphere of creation. And these atmospheres of creation would be necessary for the building of the European church, which would be feudalism.